Quadriga special. Too frail to carry on. The Pope steps down. If all goes to plan, the Catholic Church will have a new pontiff in time for Easter. German Pope Benedict's decision to step down came as a complete shock. He says he's resigning because of his advanced years and that he no longer feels he has the strength to do the job. He deliberated for some time before making this decision in the interests of the Catholic Church. It's very rare for a pope to resign, but not unprecedented. The last time a pope willingly stepped down was in 1294. Pope Benedict is 85 years old and will step down as spiritual leader of the world's more than 1 billion Catholics on February 28th. Your host today is Melinda Crane.
Hello and welcome to this special edition of Quadriga. What does Pope Benedict's decision mean for the Church, and how would we evaluate his legacy? Those are just two of the issues that we want to talk about today with three people who've been following the career of this pontiff closely. And they are John Berwick. He is DW's Religious Affairs Correspondent, and he is also my fellow correspondent on the political desk at DW. He's a British-born journalist trained in philosophy and theology, a former Carmelite, and he previously worked with South African and British media. Philip Gessler is covering religion and society for the German public radio station Deutschlandradio Kultur. He's also reported on religious affairs for German magazines and newspapers. And in 2004, he published a book on new forms of anti-Semitism. And Derek Scully covers Germany and Poland for the Irish Times. He's also reported from New York for the Irish Voice, the leading Irish-American newspaper in the U.S., and he has followed Pope Benedict around a number of his European destinations while he's been in office. John Berwick, this is the first time in nearly 6 centuries that a pope has resigned. So a rather radical step from a pontiff who many had viewed as very conservative.
Yes, I'm going to say right at the beginning, I think it's a mistake to say that he's very conservative. He's actually a reformer. And I think I said this when he became Pope. People would be surprised at how much he is a reformer. He's in many ways a man who thinks in very bold, very large terms. And to me, it wasn't a huge surprise, today's news, because when his predecessor, John Paul II, was ill, one knew that he was going to get very seriously ill, that he had Parkinson's disease. Joseph Ratzinger, as Pope Benedict was called, the Cardinal Ratzinger, dared to say in public that, of course, it was the Pope's personal decision whether he resigned or not, but it should be in the modern age. It should be something that a Pope should consider that he is perhaps not physically anymore up to the job. That was greeted with scorn and outrage by a lot of people in the Church. But it just shows how Ratzinger was thinking very much in modern terms and the modern demands on the papacy. So it is not a surprise to me that at 85, ailing health, that he's made this decision.
Philip Gessler, John Berwick suggesting there that the Pope then had a sense of duty, perhaps, that impelled him to step down because he felt that physically he couldn't meet the demands of the job. Is that the interpretation that you would take as well? And were you also perhaps somewhat less than surprised by this decision?
Well, I was surprised, and as far as I know, many in the Vatican were surprised as well. But it's true that he said before that a pope could consider to resign. So it was in the possibilities that a pope could do. I think it's true that he saw, first of all, the Church and his duties he had for the Church, and he could see that he wasn't able to do the job as good as he wanted to do it, and I think you can see it from the Vatileaks affair that in the end he wasn't the boss in his own house, and so it was clear that it also had to do with fading power.
Mm-hmm. Derek Scully, you are from Ireland. You cover Poland, two very, very deeply Catholic countries, of course. What are you hearing from those two countries, and perhaps from here in Germany as well, about people's sense of the legacy of this Pope?
Well, I have two contacts in Ireland who actually know the Pope quite well. One was a former doctoral student of him, and I asked him recently, I said, how's the Pope doing? He said, mentally he's fine, physically it's starting to deteriorate. We could all see it perhaps at the Christmas Mass and so on, but they said mentally he's fine. So I think he's just said, look, the demands, the physical demands of a papacy, a modern media papacy, which I think Pope John Paul sort of initiated, he was always struggling to keep up with that. He was a lot older when he became 20 years older than the previous Pope when he took office. So I think he just said enough is enough. And I was talking to some people I know down in Bavaria who were terribly surprised when he became Pope in 2005. They were even more surprised today, they said, but when they thought about it, they said, people in his hometown, his birthplace, they said it's courageous and it's very humble. And those two things are in keeping with the way he's approached his papacy, and he's actually standing down with dignity.
Many people at that time, John Berwick, when he did take on his office, I think he was 78 years old. That made him the oldest pope since 1730 to be starting out in office at that age. Many people thought he would be a caretaker pope. Do you think in the end he was one?
It's a difficult question. I think, yes, in a way, he was, because I think that looks ahead to something we may discuss later, who is a possible likely successor. I think he does stand at a pivotal point in the modern church, where we are seeing important changes and reform movements in the church. In that sense, he is a kind of caretaker, covering part of the process of reform that is going on. I think, though, that he is much more than that, not a caretaker in the sense of being somebody who simply kept the shop going and didn't contribute anything. On the contrary, there's been no pope in living memory, certainly, who's written as much as pope. Theological works, his study of the life of Christ, for example, which I think will be of enduring value. And I think he's also, in his very quiet, modest way, he's also pointed ahead to the kind of renewal that is necessary within the church. Very often the discussion about renewal in the Catholic Church and reforms in the Catholic Church are confined to a very superficial level of questions of should there be married priests, should homosexuality be allowed, and so on. These, of course, are all very important issues. Benedict has focused on something far deeper. He's talking about the necessity to people to personally re-engage with their faith, for it to become a force in their lives. That's something deeply spiritual, and that will be one of his legacies, I think. That is certainly not the work of a caretaker.
I'm wondering if the other two guests, Philip Gessler and Derek Scully, would agree with that term renewal. As we mentioned, many people view this pope as a very, very conservative pope. Interestingly enough, he began his career as a young man, really with some liberal theological positions, and then increasingly moved to the right as he rose in the hierarchy here in Germany and later on within the Vatican. Philip Gessler, would you also refer to his actions as pope as actions of renewal? He reinstated, after all, old forms of the Latin Mass, took a number of steps that people viewed, in fact, as moving backward.
Yes, I really can't see where he could be seen as a reformer. In many ways, he just awakened all the great achievements of the Second Vatican Council. And you might say that in a deeper way, finding back the roots, the deep impressions of faith is also a way of renewal. But in the end, the centralization towards Rome, that everything which was important in the last years was centralized in Rome and was decided by the Vatican, is, I think, just a very clear sign that it wasn't a reformer pope, and I really have problems to see any of reform steps he might have taken.
Well, before perhaps reform is the wrong word, I would almost consider to be quite radical, to be a conservative pope in a liberal age. It would be very easy to be a liberal pope in a liberal age. That would actually you'd be pushing at an open door. You'd be saying what people want to say. The fact that he chose not to do that is really quite, I thought, quite radical. Of course, in the tradition of the Catholic Church, less so, but in the modern age in which we live, and that he didn't feel the need to go along with a sort of a status quo or a zeitgeist. You could argue whether that was good for the Church or good for society, but it certainly was radical in that sense. But I do find it was a bit of a contradiction on the one hand to say people need to look inside themselves, the Church is in them, and they need to go back to the Scriptures, they need to go back to the roots, is really one of his key messages. And yet at the same time you saw the same old centralised centre of gravity towards Rome, and on many of the problematic issues, this notion that everyone is waiting for some solution to come from Rome, and either overwhelmed or the wheels are just turning so slowly. You cannot be asking people to talk amongst yourselves, work it out amongst yourselves, go back to your roots. Oh, by the way, don't decide anything because we have the final word in Rome, and that does seem a bit of a contradiction.
John, I'll
Yes.
let you rebut what you just heard there, but if you'll just add to it, please. He, of course, was a doctrinal conservative at any rate. He was also a Vatican insider when he became Pontiff, a European. Did he ultimately, in that sense, reinforce and also in his person represent the Vatican's insularity?
No, I don't have this view of him at all, and I will give a concrete example as somebody said to me in Rome. People used to flock to Rome to see John Paul II. They come to Rome now to listen to Benedict, and I think that's very significant. I think that there are people in Germany and the German Church actually who haven't listened. If they listened more closely, they would hear really quite radical ideas. I think, for example, his last day of his last visit to Germany in Freiburg, he delivered a speech which I thought personally was dynamite. What he actually said was, and the German bishops sat there with rather stony faces, most of them, not wanting to believe what they were hearing, he said, talking about the process of secularization and the separation of church and state, he said the church has often experienced this as a painful diminution of its power, but it's always in retrospect been a strengthening of the church. And the church ought not to be frightened of the fact that it is losing power in society. There it will rediscover its strength. I think what he was actually saying in the context of the German church, just about as clearly as he could say, is things like German bishops receiving their salaries from the German state, the German tax system collecting taxes for people are the sorts of things that alienate many people within the church, and the church has to discover a kind of the German church also. The church in Europe has to, if it is to be renewed, it has to discover a new kind of poverty. In a quite literal sense, perhaps, but certainly in a metaphorical sense, a kind of spiritual poverty, a less arrogant. It has had a tradition of a kind of arrogant attitude towards society where it's been very, very close to the political forces through the centuries.
Well, I cannot agree because first, the Vatican itself is receiving quite a lot of money from Germany, and if the Pope says, well, maybe the church tax is not the proper way to get money, it's a little bit strange from my point of view because he's getting a lot of money from Germany itself. And on the other hand, if you look at, for example, to France, you can see a church which was, magnificent in the last centuries and now is declining to poverty. And I can't see whether this church in France is so vivid and
it doesn't happen automatically, but I think what he was saying, of course it doesn't happen automatically, that you simply make people poor automatically, they then become spiritual. But I think what he was saying, what he said very clearly, was that this is a chance. This is a chance for the church that in the situation where it sees itself losing power, where it sees itself also, and the church, of course, in Germany is very worried about the fact that with people leaving, that it has less and less income. He was addressing specifically that point, and he said, this is a chance for the church to to rediscover its real vocation in society. I lived for many years in Africa, where the church is, of course, burgeoning, and where the church is very, very strong, and where there aren't these debates, actually. There are various other debates and criticisms, of course, about the church and the centralization of power and so on, but there is a very, very vibrant church where, as we know, the Catholic Church is often the only NGO, if you like, that is functioning in many states, where clinics, hospitals, schools are all dependent on the Catholic Church, and where the Church itself is very loved and where the faith is very vibrant. And in comparison, I must say I feel extremely sad when I'm in Western Europe. I feel, as a colleague said from a large Berlin newspaper who was standing next to me during that speech in Freiburg, said to me, he said in German, he said to me, that was the Pope's farewell to the Western Church.
Yeah, could be.
Dirk Scully, this was, of course, the first German Pope in hundreds of years. What do you think that he meant for this country, for Germany?
It was extraordinary. Let's think back to 2005. Everyone remembers the World Cup in Germany as this moment when suddenly the world realised Germany was not the Germany they thought it was. But this came before that. And I think that actually kicked things off. And I think for people here, I hope...
Aren't you going to remind us of the headline?
Yes, in Pat, we're Pope. The shock and amazement and delight that people didn't hate them as much as they thought they were hated. In Germany, that's what really was quite extraordinary. I know people from the Die Welt or from the Bild-Zeitung newspaper who came up with this, and the world has changed now. Obviously, we've had the Euro crisis, and perhaps some people's views of Germany have darkened again. But at that moment in history, that was remarkable. And that came before FIFA had the World Cup here. The Catholic Church was the first to act. So in terms of the positive vibe, that was great. Unfortunately, I saw quite quickly here expectations were built up to such an extent that he could have done nothing except disappoint, particularly in Germany. And I think people expected the old Ratzinger to disappear and somehow be a nice, warm, soft Pope, a cuddly Pope. And he stayed true to himself, and this caused great upset, I think, in Germany, that he didn't contradict his earlier teachings or the previous, from his previous time in Rome. But if expectations were disappointed, that says more about the expectations, I think, than it actually says about this person. But yes, a German pontiff, who would have thought? And yes, for a German pontiff to be resigning again, and we won't forget this one in a hurry.
Philip Gessler, he did, during a visit to Germany, commemorate the liberation of the concentration camps. He went to Auschwitz. What did those gestures mean for you as a German, to see this Pope do those things?
Well, he wasn't the first Pope to do these kind of things. John Paul II did similar actions, similar words, took similar words in the year 2000 towards the Jews. And John Paul II was the first Jew to visit a synagogue in Rome. So I was...
The first Pope to visit.
Yeah, the first Pope. So I was quite happy that Joseph Ratzinger, Benedict the 16th, was taking the same path. But I really liked most of the things he said in the Christian-Jewish relationship problem. But it wasn't so extraordinary compared to what the John Paul II did.
There had, Jean Berg, been some questions about Pope Benedict's involvement in, for instance, the FLAC youth groups in his youth in Germany as Joseph Ratzinger, and also later on the degree to which he was or was not associated in some ways with Nazi forces. Was any of that criticism, do you think, really well-founded?
I know that it wasn't. No, it wasn't. In fact, I think it was emblematic of a kind of hate campaign that started astonishingly as soon as it became known that he had been elected Pope. It was actually in the British tabloid press, of course. God's Rottweiler was, I think, the headline in one of the newspapers.
From Hitler's youth to paparazzi.
That was also another. And the reality is, putting it very, very briefly, but it's actually as far as I know, it is uncontested by historians that in the last days and months of the war, people were simply drafted in this country into the Hitler Youth movement. It wasn't a question of people volunteering and joining. He was drafted into an anti-aircraft unit. He himself says that he never fired a shot, and that's quite probable that he didn't. He was just a schoolboy, and he in fact ran away from his unit in the last months of the war. There is no serious suggestion that he or his family were in any way sympathetic towards the Nazis, let alone enthusiastic members of the party or anything of that kind. No, that was just one of the many, I think, unfair criticisms that were made of him, in which he responded with a kind of himself, with a really quite remarkable patience and gentleness that he himself, as far as I know, never ever even remarked or defended himself about this. He simply ignored it.
So as far as I can see, no disagreement among you about the degree to which he perhaps improved or at least did not harm relations with Jewish groups. But what about Islam, Derek Scully? There was a great deal, when we look at criticism, when we look at what people would consider to be the negative side of the ledger, there was, of course, a great deal of criticism about his relations with Islam, beginning with a speech that he also made here in Germany on one of his first visits. How do you see his remarks on Islam and where he took the church in its relations with Islam?
Oh, it's a very complex issue. He was speaking in Regensburg to church colleagues, and it was a rather complex issue. He was citing a Byzantine emperor from, I think, the 11th century who had some choice things to say about Islam, not very friendly. I think from my memory, he was basically saying that you cannot convince people of the value of your religion with violence, and you cannot win people over. God is not pleased by blood, and so on. And once you remove those quotation marks and attribute it to the Pope, of course you've got a huge scandal. And this went around the world, and there were huge protests in the Islamic world. But the problem, I think, was exactly what we just heard, that it said really a lot more about what people wanted the Pope to say. And I think personally it said a lot more about, it was unfortunate, and he should not have perhaps, it should not have been so complicated and difficult to understand that people would think it was him saying these things. But I think a lot of people just wanted him to have been the person who said these things. So the notion that it was attributed to somebody else and he was citing somebody, a lot of that got lost in the mix. And I think a lot of people wanted it to be lost in the mix. And they wanted to have a fuss, and they want him to be Hitler Youth, and they wanted this. And I've seen that running, it's been a thread, particularly in Germany, running through his papacy, that they want to assume the worst until he proves differently. Well, that's being proven guilty until you're proven innocent. And that's been a thread that I found unfortunate, particularly in the German coverage of this papacy.
You mentioned that speech cited conversations, I think it was, between a Persian philosopher and, was it a pope, or who was the other party to that conversation? In any event, it cited a slightly arcane discussion, many centuries old. And Philip Gessler, those of us who work in the modern media, we sometimes wondered whether this very intellectually inclined doctrinal thinker perhaps didn't have quite the right communication strategy for the 21st century.
That's quite obvious, I think. He was living in his, more or less in his books, quite good books, more or less, but he was living there, and that's not the right place to live as a pope. A pope must be a politician as well. And maybe he was a little bit naive, thinking that he could go on being the professor of theology at the in Rome, in the Vatican, but that's not possible. I think that's one of his main errors he did, that he was thinking, I can go on as I did before. He couldn't, and that's one of the reasons he made so many politically difficult decisions.
John Berwick, an error or sometimes also a strength?
I see it quite differently. I do think it's a great strength. It is, to me, a sense of huge relief that we have somebody, or have had somebody, a public figure, who did not simply speak in sound bites for the media. That's what I meant earlier when I was referring to a colleague telling me in Rome that people came to listen to him. And I have travelled just recently quite a bit in Eastern Europe, where Orthodox. The Orthodox Church is, of course, predominant. And it's interesting talking to Orthodox clergy and that there is a great suspicion about the Roman Catholic Church, has been for centuries. Of course, it is the second largest Christian group. There is a huge sympathy for Benedict. Really, that has surprised me. It is, of course, well known that Orthodox Christianity is very close to his heart, and he wanted very much to encourage, and he has behind the scenes encouraged unity, even at the expense of good relations with the Protestant churches. Those are the kinds of achievements, I think, if that's the right word, within his papacy that will be seen much later.
But there were, for the papacy, there did seem to be, I mean, speaking now as a journalist, I mean, there was an awful lot of mopping up that had to be done. On every trip, there was usually a bit of excitement. And in an ideal world, the kind of Pope Benedict would be the type of Pope the world needs. But, of course, we have media, we have people. It's an academic pope, but not an academic audience. So I did often speak to my colleagues in Rome about this, and I said, yes, there's often this word naive came up and so on, these mistakes, and they didn't intend it this way. And after a while, even with the most patient in the world, you do have to, like, are you learning from this? And people often said the press operation in Rome is hair-raisingly small. Yes. And in a modern media world, these people we had Chancellor Merkel had to intervene at one point because of a Holocaust denier in the Pius Brotherhood and so on.
That was certainly, let's briefly take a look at that, because that was one of the most egregious of the media scandals that arose during his tenure. He rehabilitated several members of the Pius Brotherhood, and one of them turned out to have been a Holocaust denier, Richard Williamson. How could that scandal occur?
I think his main target was to end this schisma, to end this separation of the church. And he was not building any bridges towards the priests, let's say, of the theology of liberation. He was building thousands of bridges towards the Pius brothers. And this was, I think, a very sad attempt, and it didn't turn out to go out well in the end, because the Pius brothers just said, okay, give us as much as you can, and in the end they said it isn't still enough for us. So I think that the Pius brothers, or some parts of them, are anti-Semitic, and not only Holocaust deniers. Pure anti-Semitic people. This must have been clear before the Richard Williamson scandal. So was the Pope badly advised? You mentioned earlier that perhaps he had delegated too much power at the end of his tenure. Was this the case here as well, that he perhaps was simply taking bad advice? Or did he simply make a bad decision? If you think about the great group of priests everywhere in the world, if you see that in every country there's a nunciature and a kind of embassy of the Vatican, it's really hard for me to imagine that there wasn't any warning that this could have or could occur to the church, that you could find many anti-Semitics in this Pius Brotherhood. So I think it was just too important for him to end the schisma, and for this goal he was saying, well, if there's some scandal, we can take it.
Well, I think that wasn't even the problem. I think once it even came out, there were several days of silence, so much so that the German Chancellor felt obliged to step in and say, this is not on, and I expect the Pope to say this is not on, which caused, of course, great hurt there. So I think you could argue the toss about, yes, surely the Catholic Church has apparently got the best diplomatic service in the world. They have their contacts, they should know this. But even if you say, OK, maybe they didn't know, in this case, once it had come out, nothing happened for several days. And I know the Chancellor's remarks were not received well by a lot of Catholics here, and they said she has no business, a Protestant pastor's daughter has no business telling our Pope what to do and so on. But the fact was there was a vacuum that needed to be filled. So even with the best will in the world, it did seem unfortunate, and it did seem to be a pattern of poor media moving. You don't obviously have to speak in sound bites, and you don't have to react to every tweet or newswire report. But on the other hand, we are living in a media world, and to react to that is not necessarily a sin.
Given the herd instincts of the media, it's quite astonishing that we've managed to get through more than 2/3 of this show without discussing the main scandal that dogged the Pope throughout the time that he has been in the Vatican, and that is, of course, the abuse scandal. John Barrack, how would you assess his handling of that? It was already going on when he came into office. How has he ultimately handled it in your view?
I think, for me personally, it's probably the main reason that his health has suffered, probably as severely as it has. I've been on a number of trips abroad with him, and it was very striking to me that he chose always, in an unscheduled way, to meet victims of child abuse. It was never part of the programme. That was his personal choice, I was told by his speaker. He could have presented it in a way. A lot of the people would have been prepared to and were glad to appear before the media, have appeared before the media. We know who they were, But he didn't want to. He personally refused to. He wanted to do it in a private way, away from the glare of the media, and I think not to in any way appear to be profiting from it or improving his own image in doing it. And when I was in Britain, in London, and when he was there, I remember very well, late one afternoon, we had all been speculating, the journalists, was he going to not meet any? It seemed to be very late at this stage if he wasn't going to. And we heard then the Vatican spokesman called us together and said to us, I have an announcement to make, the Pope has met with victims of child abuse, as was often the case on his trips, and gave us virtually no details. But the BBC then presented an interview with one of the victims of child abuse, who was visibly very moved and said that the Pope himself had wept. I think he was deeply moved by it, and I think that the accusations often in the press that he was responsible for a cover-up are deeply unjust. He was the person who started the investigations even before he became Pope. And I think he referred already in 2005 to this, as he called it, filth within the Church. I think that he did everything that he could, has done reasonably, saying that the victims must be at the forefront. The Church must do everything it can, first of all, to help the victims. In
fact, even changed the terminology and did not, as I understand it, continue referring to them as victims, but called them survivors, recognizing the fact that a very high percentage do, in fact, commit suicide. Derek Scully, the scandal has taken an enormous toll in your own country. The island ultimately shut down its embassy to the Holy See in 2011. Where would you say the Irish Catholic Church stands now on this issue, and also in its assessment about Benedict's handling of it?
It's quite simple. I was talking to the Archbishop of Dublin recently in Davos. I mean, the Church isn't standing anymore. The Church in Ireland, which basically kept Catholicism and Christianity alive for centuries in the Dark Ages in Europe, the Church in Ireland will biologically take care of itself. If you visit an Irish church, you will not see anyone under the age of 55, 60. It's as simple as that. And unfortunately, again and again and again, the Irish Catholic Church, I wouldn't go so far as to say the Vatican, but the Irish Catholic Church has missed one opportunity after another to show that this was unfortunate. We've learned our lesson, and so much so that most people have said, you know what, it was an abuse of trust. These people who abuse children are terrible, but the actual institutional cover-up and the notion that the Church's reputation was more important than these people whose lives were destroyed, and that there was a pattern, and the pattern repeated itself over and over again. And even when the investigations were going on, they had no real help from the Vatican. So our Prime Minister last year actually attacked the Vatican and said, this is an incredible arrogance. This isn't going back 30 years. He said, this is going back 3 years when we were trying to investigate this. So from an Irish perspective, there is the notion that there are individuals in the Church, and I would count the Pope amongst them, who are upset and tormented by this, but the institution Church perhaps less so, and perhaps maybe this is one of the reasons why he realised that as a Pope there's only so much he can do with the administration he's been dealt, and there are people there who are there longer than him and who will survive him, who perhaps have a different attitude to this than the attitude he proclaims in public on child abuse.
Philip Gessler, would you agree with that assessment? Did he do enough? Could he have done more?
It's very difficult to say. I think at the head of the Congregation of Faith, which
his prior position,
Cardinal Ratzinger took it for more than 20 years, I think. He was very well informed what was happening concerning sexual abuse by priests in the Catholic Church all over the world. You can say so that he might be more aggressive, more taking action than other Vatican leaders at that point, but still it's very difficult to imagine that it wasn't clear for him how deeply involved the Catholic Church was in this scandal. So saying that he personally was moved meeting with former children who were abused could be, but still there's some responsibility because of this 20 years in office and at the head of the Congregation of Faith.
If I could relativize that a little bit, I think he wasn't, of course, Pope at the time, and we know there are several examples, at least, that we know that whether that was a right decision or not, I personally think it was the wrong decision. We know that John Paul II, confronted with the issues, first of all refuted them, said he didn't believe them, and he also protected various quite prominent child abusers whom he personally believed when they said to him this was not true. And the background to that, it leads to a huge discussion, of course, but the background to that, without in any way justifying it, I think it was wrong of him. The background is, of course, that he grew up in communist East, in the communist East, in Poland, where he was used to the Catholic clergy being routinely framed for all kinds of things by the communist regime. He knew this, and he was a man who himself, I think, I'm prepared to believe, who couldn't imagine a priest doing this. He was prepared when people said this is simply people who are against the Church, who are concocting these stories. John Paul II believed it. Ratzinger, we have good evidence to believe. Ratzinger cautioned John Paul II again and again and said we need to go to investigate this more openly. But ultimately it's his sense of duty, it's a very old-fashioned word, but he is a person who has a very strong sense of duty, that he accepted the decision of his superior. And the great irony is that, of course, when his superior died, he then became Pope, and he was left, as it were, carrying the can for things that did not happen while he was Pope. And he, in a way that shows his personal greatness, I think, but really as a word I don't use lightly, is that he has never criticized his predecessor in public for this. He has simply accepted and taken upon himself all the hateful and scornful things said about him and about the Church without defending himself.
We could now, of course, devote the rest of our program to this subject, but I think that I am going to ask you instead to talk a bit about what's ahead for the Church now. This is, of course, the first time, as we discussed, in centuries that a pope has stepped down. The last time that happened, there was a schism in the Church. There were two popes who were claiming simultaneously to be in charge. Derek Scully, is there any concern about how well-equipped the Church is now to handle this step?
Well, I personally would be worried about his pension. I don't know if there is a pension plan. There is no precedent for this. I hope it's not a 14th century pension he'll be getting. And also, what do you do with a former pope? We have the Dutch Queen is standing down. Queen Elizabeth is hanging on. What do you do with this person? How do you keep them? I mean, they cannot disappear from the planet. He is still a man. He is still an intellectual. He doesn't cease to have authority just because he's no longer pope. He has a different type of authority. Whether he'll be still publishing the books, and of course. People will be worried about papal infallibility and all of these things. The Church has a lot of explanations to do about what actually happens once the authority leaves this person, and I think the actual his colleagues have to find a credible successor to him, perhaps looking beyond Europe or something. There are many people who are saying the time has come for that, whether it's another Italian or another lazy compromise from Europe, or they actually take a courageous step towards Latin America. That would be very interesting.
Is it time for a Latin American Pope, Philip Gessler?
Yeah, I think it's getting time, because in Europe the Catholic Church is quite small, has become small. Only about 25% of the Catholics in the world are living in Europe. And therefore it would really be an important step to look to Latin America, this great Catholic continent, to look for the next pope. It will change theology, and I hope it will change also the face of the Church.
John Berwick, where do we go from here?
I don't know. I think, there's an old saying in Rome that the person who goes into the conclave as a pope, thinking they will be elected pope, comes out a cardinal. It's always dangerous to predict, I think. Certainly for Catholics, they believe that the cardinals are guided by the Holy Spirit. And the Holy Spirit's always good for a surprise. I remember, Melinda, when we were talking with you and I on DWTV's journal program, news program, just before Benedict was elected, you asked me what chance there was of the next pope being German, and I'm still feeling embarrassed about the fact that I said to you, I don't think it's terribly likely, and within an hour he had been elected. So I'm going to be more cautious this time.
What would you want to see, bearing in mind we have only about a minute left, what would you want to see from the Church?
I would agree with Philip here. We've been disagreeing most of the time. I would agree with him here. I think it would be extremely good for the Church to have somebody outside of Europe as a breath of fresh air, and from a vibrant Catholic Church. I'm less convinced that it should be a South American. I'm biased because I grew up partly in Africa. I would like it to be somebody like Cardinal Napier of Durban. I think a black pope from a vibrant African church would be a tonic for the church in Europe.
Doug Scully, just one or two sentences, if you would. Would that be enough to truly renew the church, bearing in mind the kind of crisis you talked about with Ireland?
I think in Ireland the crisis has gone so far. I don't know if it can be saved now, but again, the Holy Spirit is always good for a surprise.
Thank you very much to all of you for being with us at short notice for this special edition of Quadriga, and thanks to all of you out there for tuning in. See you soon.